Gamaliel and Nicodemus are two of the few Pharisees that we actually know by name according to the New Testament. And they are atypical Pharisees. The New Testament casts the Pharisees in kind of a pejorative light, describing them as hypocritical, stuck in the rubrics and the letter of the law, often abusive of their power as religious leaders of the people. But even though Gamaliel and Nicodemus are different from the others as they're portrayed, they themselves are different from one another. Nicodemus is portrayed as a character who is in search of the truth, open-minded to things, and despite his understanding of the Old Testament scripture and how things were done in tradition of the Jewish tradition, the Mosaic law, he heard in Jesus' teaching something that resonated with his understanding of the truth. So that despite the fact that Jesus was a carpenter and not trained in the letter of the law as the Pharisees were, he heard in Jesus' teaching something that was true. And he also admitted that the signs that Jesus performed were certainly something that they needed to take note of, that clearly God must be with him for him to do such signs. Nicodemus is moved by his heart, so to speak, his desire to get closer to God, and does not allow his status as a scholar to get in the way from him being a continuous student. And yet Nicodemus knows that his position is different from the other Pharisees, and he doesn't share his opinion of Jesus with the others. Gamaliel, on the other hand, is not defending the apostles because he necessarily believes them. Instead, he is defending them, so to speak, because he's trying to stick with what he knows to be objective process, realizing that the scholars of the law, the Pharisees, don't have all the answers, that they acknowledge, according to their tradition, that God works in mysterious ways. So as much as they hope to know God's will, and they believe they know God's will, they don't have all the answers. So he's approaching this situation with the apostles as, how do you know they're not from God? There's nothing that they're saying is clearly in conflict with what we already know. We may not like it. It may seem to go against our teaching, but it doesn't necessarily go against our teaching. And if they're performing signs, how do you know where that comes from? So instead, Gamaliel's approach, his challenge to his brother Pharisees is, this is our prime directive, to try to do the will of God. And there's a limitation to what you know, and if you're going beyond what you know, if you're walking out on a limb, there's a good chance you're going to be at risk. And the risk that you're taking that you're going against God is probably greater than whatever risk these radical religious types may have as far as impact on the community. So Gamaliel is trying to win over his brothers to do nothing as opposed to do the wrong thing. He's not entirely successful. The Pharisees still have the apostles flogged. They still, at a later time, do get the apostles killed. And so Gamaliel's approach kind of falls on deaf ears. It would have been perhaps a nicer ending, that Gamaliel would have become a disciple and changed his heart, or that the Pharisees would have listened to what the apostles had to say. It doesn't work out that way. In our culture, in our church, in our individual lives, we need a combination of both Nicodemus and Gamaliel. We need to be able to use logic appropriately to realize that it gains us objectivity, that sometimes our misdirected passions can lead us off course. We have to recognize that there's a limitation to what we can know, and to be okay with the frustration that uncertainty brings. And then we also need to be like Nicodemus, people that are open enough to listen with our hearts and not just with our minds. That many times the Spirit prompts us and prompts other people, and when we hear their challenge, we hear their words, we hear them in the right context, that the truth resonates with what we already know in our hearts, despite what our logical minds may tell us. We need both characters in our lives and in our culture. People that can adhere to the letter of the law that keeps us out of harm's way, and at the same time, an openness to the Spirit that always calls us to transcend it.